The kind of cold that comes late in autumn in the northern plains doesn't just bite at the skin. It seeps into the bones, slow and merciless. The wind carried a dry hiss across the valley, bending the tall grass and making the riverbanks hum like a living thing. Michael Boone rode with his head low, collar turned up, his gloved hands stiff around the reins. His horse, a chestnut mare with a faded white blaze, pushed forward through the frost-crusted brush. Each breath rose in a thin cloud. He wasn't riding for cattle. The herds had been driven south weeks ago. Boone was checking the small traps he'd set along the creek. Wire loops hidden under the brush, meant for rabbits or fox if he was lucky. It wasn't much, but it kept meat on the table and quieted the gnaw of hunger in long winters like this. The land around him stretched bare and endless, a horizon of gray sky, dead weeds and brittle soil. It was the kind of place that swallowed sound. Out here, a man could forget what voices sounded like. Boone was 37, though the lines on his face told older stories. Years of war, of loss, of hard sun and harder solitude had carved him into a man who moved slow but steady, like he'd forgotten what it meant to hurry. A thin scar ran from his left cheekbone down to his jaw, the gift of a cavalry skirmish he no longer cared to remember. He had served once long ago, a soldier in a war that had ended for everyone but him. He had seen too many men die, and one woman he couldn't save. His wife's grave lay under the cottonwood tree behind the cabin, a small mound of earth he visited less with each passing year. She had died giving birth. The child had followed her within hours. Since then, Boone had lived alone, part out of choice, part out of punishment. The silence had become his companion. It filled the space where laughter used to live. That evening, the light was fading fast, the sun just a bruised streak behind the pines. Boone guided the mare along the creek's curve, his breath fogging as he leaned forward to check the final trap. At first, he thought the shape ahead was nothing but a tangle of brush caught in the ice, a dark lump against the silver of the water. But his horse snorted and tossed its head, uneasy. Boone's instincts stirred. He tugged the reins, scanning the bank. The shape wasn't brush, it was human. He swung down from the saddle, boots crunching through the crust of frozen mud. The figure lay half in the water, half on the bank, small, curled, unmoving. A tattered piece of deerskin clung to the body. Long black hair, tangled and heavy with ice, spread across the dirt. Boone's chest tightened. His first thought wasn't of danger, it was of memory. He had seen that stillness before, that fragile line between life and death. He crouched down, pressing his gloved fingers to the woman's shoulder. Her skin was cold, but not the cold of death. Not yet. Hell, he muttered under his breath. You picked a bad night to fall. The woman's lips were cracked, her face streaked with mud and blood. The cut along her arm ran deep, jagged, already clotted in places, but still open. Her bare feet were raw, purpled with frostbite. She looked young, maybe mid-20s, an Apache by her features, though Boone didn't need a map to know what that meant. In this country, that was enough to bring trouble. If he left her, the night would finish what fate had started. But if he took her, if settlers saw her under his roof, there'd be talk, angry talk, maybe even guns. Boone stayed crouched, the wind gnawing at the edge of his coat. The old voice in his head, the one that had kept him alive through years of war, whispered, "Walk away. Keep your life simple. Don't invite death through your own damn door." But another voice, quieter, deeper, spoke back. It was the same one that had begged him to do something when his wife went cold in his arms. The one that had screamed at him when she slipped away, and he'd done nothing but watch. He couldn't walk away again. Boone slid his arms under the woman's body. She was lighter than he expected. Bones and sinew and the faint heat of a life still hanging on. Her head lolled against his chest. "Easy now," he murmured, though she couldn't hear. "I got you." He lifted her onto his horse, securing her with an old lead rope so she wouldn't fall. The mare shifted nervously but obeyed his low, steady voice. Boone climbed up behind her, wrapped one arm around her body to keep her steady, and turned toward the timberline. The wind cut at his face as they rode. The woman's head rested against his shoulder, her breath shallow and fast. Every few minutes he looked down, watching for the faint rise and fall of her chest. Each time he saw it move, something unclenched in him, a tightness he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. By the time he reached the cabin, the sky had gone black. Smoke still curled weakly from the chimney from the fire he'd banked earlier. Boone swung down, his legs stiff from the cold, and carried her inside. The cabin was small, one room carved from rough-hewn pine. A stove sat near the center, a cot against the far wall, and shelves lined with tin and sacks. It smelled faintly of smoke and pine sap. Boone laid the woman on the bed, the wool blanket coarse but warm. Up close, her condition looked worse. Her arms swollen, the gash angry and red. Her dress was torn clear across the chest and ribs, the deerskin split and stiff with dried blood. He forced himself to look away from the exposed skin. It wasn't modesty, it was respect. She was half dead, not a spectacle. Boone fetched a tin bowl, poured water from his canteen, and grabbed what clean rags he had. The water steamed faintly in the warmth of the cabin. He cleaned the wound, working with the rough care of a man used to doing everything himself. The woman flinched when the cold water hit her, a weak gasp leaving her lips. Her eyelids fluttered, but she didn't wake. Boone pressed a rag against the bleeding until it slowed, then tore an old shirt into strips and wrapped the wound tight. He tucked the blanket around her shoulders, pulling it high to cover her. The fire crackled, light dancing across her face. Bronze skin, high cheekbones, a faint tremor still running through her. Boone stood there for a long time, staring down at her. His hands shook. Not from cold this time, but from something else. "What the hell are you doing, Boone?" he muttered. "You know better than this." But even as he said it, he knew he wasn't sorry. He stoked the fire higher until the cabin glowed warm and orange. Then he dragged a chair close to the stove, sat down and rested the rifle across his knees. Outside, the wind howled through the trees. Inside, only the pop of the fire and the woman's shallow breathing broke the silence. Boone didn't sleep. Every few minutes, he glanced at her chest, waiting for the rise and fall. He thought about the war, about the graves he'd left behind, about his wife's cold hand in his. Somewhere between those thoughts, he realized his cabin didn't feel empty anymore. Not yet safe, not yet right, but not empty. When dawn came, thin and gray through the frosted window, Boone hadn't moved from the chair. His back ached, his eyes burned, but his grip on the rifle never loosened. The woman was still alive. Her breathing was steady, her color less pale. Boone let out a long breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He didn't know her name, her story, or why she'd ended up bleeding by his creek. But as he watched the weak light creep across her face, he understood one thing clearly. Whatever came next, he was part of it now. The sun climbed higher, painting the snow outside in gold. Boone poured himself a cup of black coffee and sat by the window, staring at the horizon. Somewhere out there, he thought, was the reason this woman had nearly died. And maybe the reason he'd found her. Either way, he knew one thing for sure. The silence that had kept him company all those years had finally been broken, and there was no going back. The first light of morning crept across the cabin walls, thin and gray. Michael Boone sat slumped in his chair by the stove, his eyes gritty from a night without sleep. The rifle leaned against his leg, coffee gone cold in his hand. For a long while, he didn't move. The only sound was the faint pop of cooling embers and the steady rhythm of her breathing under the wool blanket. She was still alive. That alone was something close to a miracle. Boone's back ached as he straightened, setting the cup aside. He rubbed at the stiffness in his neck, then looked toward the bed again. The woman's face was turned toward the light now. Her skin, once gray and ghostly, had warmed to a soft bronze. Strands of black hair clung to her cheek, half shadowed by the quilt. He should have felt relief. Instead, he felt something heavier, a weight pressing behind his ribs. He didn't know what she'd been running from, but whatever it was, he knew trouble had a way of following the wounded. Boone stood stretching the stiffness from his legs. As he moved, the old floorboards creaked beneath his boots. That sound did it. The woman stirred, her fingers twitching. Then, with a sudden burst of motion, she gasped and sat upright. The quilt slid from her shoulders as her eyes flew open. Dark, sharp, disoriented. Before Boone could say a word, she moved. In one desperate, feral motion, she lunged forward, pushing him back into the chair. Her knees pressed against the edge of the mattress, straddling him. Her hands hit his chest hard, pinning him where he sat. The movement was fast, raw, not from strength, but from pure fear. Boone froze, his breath catching. Her hair fell around them both, wild and tangled, her eyes burning with terror. The torn deerskin clung to her body, split at the seams. Her breath came in ragged bursts, each one trembling. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. Then she spoke, her voice low, broken, threaded with panic. "If you put me outside," she said in halting English, "I die." The words hit him harder than the shove. Boone's chest tightened. He realized what this was. Not an attack, not madness, but desperation. The woman wasn't fighting him. She was pleading in the only way she knew how. Her trembling hands pressed harder against his shirt. Her eyes searched his face like a trapped animal trying to read mercy. Boone swallowed, his throat dry. Slowly, carefully, he lifted his hands. Not to push her away, but to steady her arms. "Hey," he said, voice low even. "No one's putting you out." She stared at him, unblinking. "I don't throw people to die," he added. "Not out there, not anywhere." For a long moment, the cabin stayed silent, except for the faint crackle of the fire. Her breathing softened, her shoulders trembling. Then the tension began to drain from her body. Her grip loosened. She sagged forward, her forehead falling against his shoulder. Boone sat still, hardly daring to breathe. He could feel her shaking. From fear, from exhaustion, from the sheer edge of survival. He waited until her breathing steadied, then spoke again, softer. "You're safe here. You hear me?" "Safe." Her head moved slightly. Maybe a nod, maybe just a faint motion of trust trying to take root. Boone shifted carefully, easing her back toward the bed. She didn't resist this time. When he laid her down, she watched him with wary eyes, but the fight was gone. He pulled the quilt back over her, tucking it high around her shoulders. Her fingers clutched the edge tightly, as if to make sure it wouldn't be taken away. Boone turned to the stove, busying his hands. He needed something to do, something to make the air in the room less heavy. He threw 2 small logs into the fire, the sound sharp and grounding. Then he poured water into the tin pot, added coffee grounds, and set it to boil. The smell began to fill the room. Strong, bitter, familiar. Behind him, he could hear her breathing again, slower now. When he turned back, she was still awake. Her eyes followed him, cautious, unreadable, like a creature watching to see if the trap would spring again. Boone poured a cup and set it on the small table beside the bed. "You drink?" he asked quietly. She didn't move. He gestured again, slower this time, sliding the cup closer. "It's warm. Helps." Her gaze flicked from the cup to his face, then back again. After a long hesitation, she reached out, fingers trembling, and took it. The cup rattled against the saucer as she lifted it. The smell made her flinch. It wasn't familiar. Still, she sipped. Boone watched in silence, resisting the urge to fill the space with words. She finished half, then set it down. Her lips parted, cracked but no longer blue. Her voice was a whisper. "You? Not kill me?" Boone exhaled slowly. "No," he said, "not my way." Something flickered in her eyes then. Not trust, not yet, but the faintest spark of disbelief beginning to thaw. He tore a piece of bread from an old loaf, placed it beside her, along with a strip of dried venison. She hesitated, then began to eat. Her hands shook, her jaw tight as though she expected him to snatch the food away. Boone turned his gaze toward the window, giving her space. The morning light had turned gold now, spilling across the frozen yard. Outside, everything looked the same as it always had. The same fence, the same smoke curling from the stovepipe, the same endless silence. But inside, something was different. When he looked back, she was still watching him. Her eyes no longer darted like they had before. They held him, searching, studying, testing the truth of his words. He set his cup down and leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. "You're safe here," he said again. "No one's going to touch you. No one's going to hurt you. You understand?" Her eyes lingered on him, dark and unsure. Then finally she gave a small nod. Boone let out a quiet breath and leaned back. He wasn't sure which one of them had needed to hear that more. He reached for his coat, draped it over the back of the chair, and sat again by the fire. For the first time in years, the quiet in the cabin wasn't empty. It was heavy, alive even. The woman finished her meal slowly, every movement deliberate. When she was done, she looked down at her bandaged arm, touching the cloth gently. Boone noticed her doing it. "You'll heal," he said. "Might scar a bit, but you'll heal." She glanced up, confusion flickering in her expression. Maybe at his tone, maybe at his calm. "Rest," he added. "That's your only job right now." Her gaze lingered on him another moment before she lay back. The quilt rose and fell with each slow breath. Boone watched her until her eyes finally closed. He stood quiet as he could and stepped outside. The cold hit him like a slap. Frost still clung to the eaves. The world was white and still, every sound swallowed by snow. He filled a bucket at the creek, the water biting cold through his gloves. As he turned back toward the cabin, the faintest wisp of smoke drifted up through the chimney. Proof of life, small but certain. He stopped for a moment, standing in the yard, staring at the footprints that led from the creek to his door, his and hers, side by side. It struck him then, the truth of it. A single night had changed everything. When he stepped back inside, she was awake again, eyes following him from the bed. The fear hadn't left her, but something else had joined it. A quiet question she hadn't yet found words for. Boone set the bucket down, met her gaze, and nodded once. "You'll stay here till you're strong enough to walk. After that, we'll see." She didn't answer, but her shoulders loosened just a little. Boone poured her another cup of coffee, then one for himself. They drank in silence. The fire crackled, the wind whispered against the logs, and for the first time in a long time, the cabin felt like it belonged to more than one soul. Outside, the snow kept falling. Soft, relentless, endless. But inside, something fragile had begun to thaw. Boone didn't know her name yet, didn't know what kind of storm she had brought to his door. But as he watched her sip the coffee in his bed, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight, he knew one thing beyond doubt. He had done the right thing. And for the first time in years, doing the right thing didn't feel like punishment. It felt like purpose. By the third morning, the air outside had turned sharp as broken glass. Frost spread thick across the window panes, and the cabin's wood groaned under the weight of the cold. Michael Boone had risen early, splitting kindling before dawn, his breath puffing white in the half-dark. Inside, the fire he'd stoked glowed steady. The woman sat on the edge of his bed, wrapped in his old wool shirt, the sleeves hanging past her hands. The color had returned to her cheeks, a faint bronze warmth against the gray morning light. She watched him as he came back inside, every movement measured, cautious. Boone shut the door behind him, stamping snow from his boots. "You should still be resting," he said. His voice came out rough, more habit than reproach. Her gaze dropped to the bandage on her arm. The cut he'd cleaned was healing, but the skin around it still looked raw. "I can work," she said. The words clipped, halting, her accent heavy but clear. Boone raised a brow. "Work can wait. You've had enough fight for one lifetime, far as I can tell." She frowned, not understanding the humor, or maybe not believing it. Her jaw tightened. "I am not useless." The firmness in her tone caught him. For a moment, Boone didn't know what to say. He set the axe by the wall, brushed snow from his sleeves, and nodded slowly. "Didn't say you were." Silence stretched between them, broken only by the crack of the fire. She turned her face toward the flames, the light painting her profile in golden shadow. He saw the faint bruises at her temple, the small scar near her collarbone. Signs of the life she'd fled. He didn't ask yet. Whatever story she carried, it was still too close to the surface, too raw to touch. Boone busied himself with the kettle. The routine steadied him. Water, grounds, tin cups. He'd learned long ago that sometimes the best way to earn trust was to stay quiet long enough for the other person to fill the silence. When he handed her a cup, she took it carefully, fingers trembling from the heat. She sipped slow, her eyes flicking up to his, then away again. After a long pause, Boone said, "You got a name?" She froze mid-sip. The question seemed to land somewhere deep. Her lips parted, then pressed shut again, as though weighing whether the truth was safe to share. Finally, in a voice just above a whisper, she said, "Naya." Boone repeated it under his breath, tasting the sound. "Naya." She watched him, wary, uncertain. And when he didn't mock it or twist it into something smaller, her shoulders eased just a little. "That's a good name," he said quietly. "Strong." Naya looked down at her cup. For a moment, Boone thought she might smile. She didn't, but the corners of her mouth softened. The day passed in slow rhythm. Boone patched a crack in the roof above the stove, while Naya swept ash from the hearth using a bundle of twigs she'd tied together. Her movements were careful, deliberate, the kind of precision that comes from needing to prove one's place. Boone watched her from the corner of his eye. The first day she'd been a ghost. Now she was flesh in motion again, the firelight catching in her dark hair as she worked. He wondered what had driven her this far north, through cold that could freeze blood and bone. No one survived alone out here unless they were desperate or stubborn enough to try. When the chores were done, Boone boiled beans and salted pork. The smell filled the cabin, thick and heavy. They ate in silence, sitting across from each other at the rough-hewn table. Halfway through the meal, Naya broke the quiet. "You live here alone?" Boone nodded. "6 years now." "Why?" He didn't look up from his plate. The question struck deeper than she could have known. Because there wasn't anyone left worth leaving it for. Her brow furrowed. "Your family?" He set the spoon down, staring at the fire. "Wife. She died giving birth. Lost the baby, too." The air in the room shifted. Naya said nothing for a long while, her eyes lowering. Then she murmured, "You buried them?" "Under the cottonwood," he said, "behind the ridge." Her fingers tightened around the tin cup. When she spoke again, her voice trembled slightly. "In my tribe, we bury women under the open sky, so the stars can guide them back." Boone looked up then, meeting her eyes. They were dark and deep, like the land before a storm. "That's a good way," he said quietly. She nodded once, then looked away. They sat in the warmth of the fire, two people shaped by loss, neither asking for pity, neither offering it. As the night deepened, Boone leaned back in his chair, cleaning the rifle by lamplight. Naya sat across from him, mending a tear in his shirt with thread she'd found in the trunk. After a long silence, she spoke again. Softer this time, but steadier. "I was cast out," she said, "from my people." Boone looked up, the cloth stilling in his hand. "They said I shamed the chief," she continued, eyes fixed on the thread in her hands. "Men. They took women, hurt them. I spoke against it. The chief said I broke the law of silence, so they left me in the mountains." The needle slipped. A small drop of blood beaded on her finger. She didn't flinch. Boone's jaw tightened. He'd seen that kind of cruelty before. Not just from one people, but from men in general. Men who took what they wanted and called it power. He set the rifle down and leaned forward, his voice low. "You did the right thing." Naya looked up, her eyes shining in the dim light. "Doing right doesn't save you." Boone nodded slowly. "No, but it lets you look yourself in the mirror come morning." She studied him, as if weighing whether to believe that. Then she nodded once. Small but real. The silence that followed wasn't heavy this time. It was something else. A fragile peace. The kind that grows only between people who've both seen too much. Boone tossed another log on the fire. The flame leapt high, painting the cabin walls gold. Outside, wind whistled through the trees, low and distant. Naya set the needle aside, wrapping her mended shirt carefully. She moved to sit closer to the stove, drawing her knees to her chest beneath the blanket. Boone noticed the faint shiver that passed through her, not from cold, but from something deeper, a weariness that went past the body. He wanted to tell her she was safe now, that the worst was behind her, but he'd lived too long to believe that himself. So instead, he said the only thing that felt true. "Tomorrow will be better." She looked up, her face half lit by the fire. "You always believe that?" "Not always," Shaboon said, "but I keep saying it till it feels true." Something in that answer made her exhale. Not quite a laugh, but close. When the fire burned low, Boone banked the coals and stood. "You take the bed," he said. "I'll keep the chair." Naya hesitated, her brow furrowing. "You don't sleep?" "Not much." He settled back into the old chair, pulling his coat tight. The wood creaked beneath him. Across the room, Naya lay back on the bed, eyes open, watching him in the half-dark. "Michael," she said softly, testing his name for the first time. He looked over. "Thank you." He didn't answer, just gave a small nod. The wind pressed against the walls, rattling the shutters. The fire's glow flickered across the floorboards. Boone sat there long after she closed her eyes, listening to the steady sound of her breathing. The silence didn't feel empty anymore. It felt shared. And for a man who'd lived half a decade without another soul to speak to, that small sound was enough to make the long, bitter night feel almost bearable. Outside, the snow had stopped falling. The sky cleared, revealing a wash of stars above the frozen land. Cold, endless, and bright. Boone leaned his head back against the chair, eyes half closed. Tomorrow, he thought, he'd teach her how to carry water, how to split kindling without tearing the wound open again. Maybe he'd ask more about her tribe, her name, the land she came from. But not tonight. Tonight, it was enough to know her name, and that she was still breathing. By the fifth morning, the sky had turned the color of lead. The air bit harder, and the light that filtered through the cabin window felt pale and thin. Michael Boone rose before dawn, as he always did, stirring the fire until it came back to life. Naya was already awake, sitting on the bed with her knees drawn up beneath the quilt. Her dark hair spilled over her shoulders, loose and uncombed. The bruises on her face had faded to faint shadows, but something in her eyes still held the look of a hunted animal, alert, waiting. Boone poured her a tin cup of coffee and set it on the table beside her. "You sleep?" he asked. She shook her head. "Too quiet." Boone gave a small half-smile. "Most folks would call that peace." She looked toward the window, her voice low. "Peace feels strange when you've never had it." He didn't answer right away. He'd spent years chasing that same quiet, trying to find comfort in silence. But he knew what she meant. Peace could feel like a trap when you'd lived too long, waiting for danger. He stepped outside, the cold slapping him awake. The world was white from one horizon to the other, the kind of clean, sharp silence that comes only after a storm. Snow crunched under his boots as he walked toward the fence line, a bucket in one hand, rifle slung over his shoulder. Halfway to the creek, something caught his eye. Tracks. At first he thought they might belong to deer, but the shape wasn't right. Too heavy, too square. Boot prints. His stomach tightened. He crouched down, brushing away the top layer of fresh snow. The tracks ran parallel to the creek, leading toward the cabin before veering back into the trees. Men had been close. Boone's instincts, dulled by a few quiet days, roared back to life. He scanned the tree line, his hand resting on the rifle stock. The tracks were faint, half filled by drifting snow, but recent enough to raise the hair on his neck. Someone had come looking in a mess, and left again. He followed them a few paces before turning back. There were too many ways for a man to die chasing shadows in this weather. Better to be ready where the ground was known. When he stepped back inside, the heat hit him like a wave. Naya looked up from where she sat near the fire, mending a tear in the old quilt. "What is it?" she asked. Boone hung his coat, his voice even but clipped. "Tracks, not animal. Boots." Her hands stilled on the fabric. For a heartbeat, she didn't breathe. Then quietly, "They found me." Boone studied her face, the way her eyes darted toward the door, the faint tremor in her fingers. "You sure?" "They always find me," she whispered. "They don't stop until—" She cut herself off, pressing her lips tight. He crouched beside her, his tone steady. "You're safe here. Whoever's out there won't touch you." Naya's eyes flicked up wide and glistening. "You don't know these men. They take women. Sell them. I ran. They'll kill you if they think you helped." Boone held her gaze, unblinking. "Let them try." The words came out calm, but they landed heavy in the air between them. He meant them. Naya shook her head, her voice trembling. "You shouldn't have found me that night." Boone straightened, his jaw tightening. "And you'd be frozen dead by now if I hadn't." Her eyes shone with tears she refused to let fall. "Better that than what they'll do when they come." Boone crossed to the stove, threw in another log, and turned back to face her. His voice stayed low, but every word was carved from stone. "I buried one woman already. I ain't burying another." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The fire popped, sending sparks across the stove's iron grate. Finally, Naya exhaled, a small, broken sound. "Then teach me," she said. "Teach me to fight." Boone froze. He looked at her, truly looked. Beneath the fear, he saw something fierce, something unyielding. The same fire that had made her stand up to her own people. The same pride that had nearly gotten her killed. He nodded once. "All right." He fetched the rifle from the wall and handed it to her. The barrel gleamed dully in the firelight. She hesitated before taking it, her fingers wrapping around the cold metal. "It's heavy," she said. "You get used to it." He showed her how to check the chamber, how to steady her stance, how to brace against the kick. Her first attempt went wrong, her shoulder jerking back, the muzzle tipping skyward. Boone stepped behind her, placing one calloused hand lightly on her arm. "Don't fight it," he said. "Let it roll through you like breathing." She tried again. The shot cracked through the still morning air, echoing off the trees. A plume of snow burst from a log 20 yards away. When the smoke cleared, Naya's eyes were wide, part shock, part something else. Boone nodded. "Not bad." She looked down at her hands, the faintest hint of pride creeping through her fear. "It feels different, like power." He gave a small smile. "That's what scared men the most. A woman who ain't afraid to take it back. They spent the rest of the morning practicing. Between each shot, Boone kept an eye on the ridge. The tracks outside weighed on his thoughts like stones in his pocket. By noon, clouds rolled in thick and gray. Snow began to fall again. Soft at first, then heavier. Boone called it enough for the day. They went back inside, their breath steaming. Naya peeled off his oversized coat and hung it by the fire. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold, her eyes bright. Boone poured 2 cups of coffee, handing one to her. "You did good," he said. She looked into the cup, the steam rising between them. "You think they'll come soon?" He sipped his own coffee, the bitter taste grounding him. "If they're smart, they'll wait for dark." She nodded, wrapping her hands around the cup like it was something sacred. The hours dragged. Boone checked the rifle again, cleaned the revolver, set extra ammunition on the table. Naya moved quietly around the cabin, folding blankets, sweeping the floor, nervous energy finding work to do. As the sun dropped, the cabin grew dim. The fire painted everything in shades of gold and shadow. Boone sat by the window watching the snow fall thicker, erasing the world one flake at a time. "Michael," Naya said softly from behind him. He turned. "If they come," she hesitated. "If I die here, you bury me where the stars can see." Boone's chest tightened. He didn't answer right away. Then he said, "You're not dying. Not here." She held his gaze for a long moment, then gave a small nod. Night came early. Boone doused the lanterns, leaving only the faint orange flicker of the stove. The wind picked up, moaning low through the cracks in the logs. He sat near the door, rifle across his knees. Naya lay on the bed, fully dressed, eyes open. Neither of them slept. Hours passed before the sound came. Faint, distant, but unmistakable. Boots on snow, more than one pair. Boone rose, slow and silent. He glanced at Naya. She was already sitting up, clutching the revolver he'd left by her side. The footsteps drew closer, crunching softly through the dark. Boone's heartbeat slowed. Steady, deliberate, the old soldier's calm settling in. A voice outside, rough and mocking, called through the cold. "Evening, cowboy. We know you got her in there." Naya flinched, gripping the gun tighter. Boone moved to the door, his voice low but hard. "You boys best keep riding. Ain't nothing here for you." Laughter answered him, cruel and sharp. "We saw her tracks by the creek. You hand her over. Maybe we let you keep breathing." Boone looked back at Naya. Her eyes were wide, but there was steel beneath the fear. "Stay low," he whispered. He turned back to the door, jaw set. "You want her," he said, voice steady as stone. "You'll have to come take her." The silence that followed was thin and deadly. Then outside, the sound of a rifle being cocked. Naya's whisper trembled across the room. "Michael." He didn't look at her, just adjusted his grip on the gun. "Get ready." The first shot shattered the night. Glass burst from the window, snow spraying across the floor. Boone dropped low, returning fire through the gap. A cry rang out. A man hit, falling back into the dark. Another shot cracked, splintering the doorframe. The cabin filled with smoke and echoing thunder. Naya crouched behind the bed, her breath ragged. Boone moved fast, reloading, firing again. Each shot measured, ruthless, calm. When the gunfire stopped, the only sound left was the wind. Boone stayed still, listening. Then came the faint sound of boots retreating, fading into the trees. He lowered the rifle, chest heaving. "They'll be back," Naya said quietly. Boone nodded, eyes still on the door. "Then we'll be ready." Outside, the snow fell heavier, covering the tracks of the men who'd come to claim her. Inside, the cabin glowed with firelight and gun smoke. Two silhouettes bound by a promise neither had spoken aloud, but both understood. If death came knocking again, they'd face it together. The night after the gunfire stretched longer than any Michael Boone had lived through since the war. He sat in the old chair by the stove, rifle across his lap, the acrid smell of gunpowder still hanging in the air. The cabin walls carried the scars, a bullet hole through the window frame, splinters along the door. Outside, snow fell thick and quiet, covering the tracks of the men who'd come to take her. Naya sat by the fire wrapped in a quilt, the revolver still resting in her lap. She hadn't spoken for hours. Her eyes stayed on the flames, her face pale in the flickering light. When dawn finally came, it was gray and sharp. Boone stood, stretching the stiffness from his legs, and opened the door to a world washed white. The snow reached his boots, smooth and untouched, except for the blood frozen near the woodpile. He followed the trail a few feet, scanning the ridge. The valley was silent, But the silence wasn't peace. It was the kind that hides things. Inside, Naya stirred when she heard him return. They gone? Boone nodded. For now. She exhaled softly, relief mixed with dread. They'll come again. Boone leaned his rifle against the wall, his voice even. Then we end it next time. No running. Naya looked up at him. The hard line of his jaw, the quiet certainty in his voice. She'd seen that look before, on men who had nothing left to lose. Only this time, it wasn't for revenge, it was for her. She rose slowly, crossing the room to stand beside him. The firelight caught in her dark hair, turning it copper at the edges. Why do you fight for me? She asked. Boone's answer came low and simple. Because someone should have. Her breath caught. She turned away, blinking fast. For a long moment, neither spoke. The fire cracked. The wind moaned against the walls, and life, fragile, stubborn life, went on. That day they prepared. Boone reinforced the door with planks pulled from an old shed. He checked the rifle twice, cleaned the revolver, and cut fresh wood for the stove. Naya helped where she could, her movements quiet but steady. At one point, Boone caught her outside, scanning the tree line, her hair whipped by the cold wind. Her eyes were fierce again, not desperate this time, but determined. Get back in, it's freezing, he called. She turned, shaking her head. If they come, I see them first. Boone smiled faintly despite himself. You're something else, Naya. She shrugged, the corner of her mouth twitching. So they told me, right before they left me to die. The words hit him harder than a bullet. He said nothing, only nodded toward the cabin. Inside, before I start freezing too. When the door closed behind them, the warmth returned, soft and golden. Boone poured her a cup of coffee and sat across from her. For the first time, she drank without hesitation. You ever think about going back south? She asked suddenly. He looked into the fire. I used to. Thought maybe I'd ride down to Texas, work cattle again. Then I realized there ain't much left down there worth chasing. Naya studied him. So you stay here alone? Boone gave a half smile. Used to be alone. She met his gaze and didn't look away. Something passed between them. Quiet, sure, undeniable. The kind of understanding that doesn't need words. That night, Boone didn't sleep. The wind had died, leaving the forest too still. He sat by the stove, oiling the rifle, ears tuned to every creak in the timbers. Naya rested near the bed, her breathing soft but restless. Just before dawn, the dogs down in the valley started barking again. Distant, then closer. Boone's spine straightened. They're back, he whispered. Naya sat up instantly, reaching for the revolver. Her eyes were steady now. Outside, the crunch of boots broke the silence. Slow, deliberate. Boone's pulse slowed, the calm of old habit taking over. He blew out the lantern, the cabin sinking into dim firelight. 3 shadows appeared through the frosted window. Men with rifles moving cautiously across the snow. Boone crouched low near the door. He could see their breath fogging in the air. The first voice came, the same rough drawl from the night before. You made a mistake, cowboy. Should have handed her over. Boone's voice was quiet but clear. You boys talk too much. A laugh answered him. Then the world exploded. Gunfire tore through the morning stillness. The first shot shattered the window. Boone returned fire, his rifle thundering in the enclosed space. Naya ducked low, crawling behind the table. Splinters flew across the floor. Boone fired again, hitting one man square. The figure dropped in the snow, unmoving. The others scattered for cover. For a moment, there was only the echo of gunfire and the raw smell of smoke. Then a shot ripped through the cabin wall, grazing Boone's shoulder. He hissed, teeth clenched, and dropped behind the stove. Michael, Naya cried. I'm fine. He reloaded fast, blood soaking through his shirt. The footsteps outside shifted. One man circling to the back. Boone moved to intercept, but before he could reach the rear window, a burst of sound cracked from behind him. Naya, sir. She'd fired through the open door, clean and steady. A cry followed outside, then silence. Boone froze, staring at her. She stood in the doorway, revolver trembling in her grip, smoke rising from the barrel. Her eyes were wide, her breathing fast, but she didn't back down. He crossed to her, gently lowering her hand. Easy now, he said softly. It's done. She blinked, tears mixing with sweat. He would have killed you. Boone nodded, his voice low. I know. Outside, the snow lay disturbed. 3 dark shapes in the pale light. The wind began to pick up again, carrying the scent of pine and smoke. Boone stepped out into the cold, scanning the ridge one last time. No movement, no sound. When he came back inside, Naya was kneeling by the fire, staring into the flames. Her shoulders trembled. Boone crouched beside her, his voice barely above a whisper. It's over. She looked at him then, eyes shining through tears. It's never over. Not for people like me. Boone reached out, placing a hand on her arm. Maybe it can be. Maybe not all stories end the same way. For the first time, she didn't argue. She leaned into him, letting the weight of exhaustion and grief fall where it could. Boone held her, his hand steady at her back. The fire crackled, filling the silence that followed. By evening, the storm had cleared. Boone buried the men behind the ridge, marking nothing. The snow would take care of the rest. When he came back, the cabin was warm and still. Naya was sitting by the window, watching the last light fade from the hills. They won't come again, he said quietly. I know, she replied. Boone poured 2 cups of coffee and joined her. They sat side by side, the world outside wrapped in white silence. After a long while, Naya spoke. You could have let me go that first night. Boone smiled faintly. Could have, but you didn't. He looked at her, the lines around his eyes deepening. Guess I got tired of letting things die when I could save them. She turned toward him then, eyes soft but certain. Then maybe we both get to start over. He didn't answer with words. He simply reached over and took her hand. Rough meeting, soft, scar meeting scar. Outside, the last of the snow drifted down in slow, lazy flakes. Inside, the two sat in quiet peace. Not the kind that feels like emptiness, but the kind that feels earned. Boone knew he'd never erase the ghost that lived behind his ribs, and Naya would always carry her own. But together, they'd found something the world had long tried to take, a place to belong. As the fire dimmed and night gathered around them, Boone spoke one last time, his voice low and steady. You ever wonder, he said, how many chances a person gets to do one right thing? Naya looked at him, eyes reflecting the dying light. Maybe just one. Boone nodded slowly, staring into the flames. Then I reckon I used mine. The wind sighed through the trees outside, soft and hollow, carrying the smell of pine and smoke into the night. And maybe that's the real question, folks. When life gives you one last chance to do right, to save someone, to stand for something, would you take it? Or would you turn away, let the cold do its work, and tell yourself it wasn't your fight? Because sometimes out here in the quiet corners of the world, that choice is all that separates the living from the lost.